It's not about volume, it's about quality.
Quality. Well, I reckon our next guest, Senator David Leyonhjelm, probably doesn't have a problem with the low number of legislative successes that have gone through the
small government
parliament.
man that he is, he would prefer less legislation than more. Should we find out?
We should find out. Senator David Leyonhjelm joins us from our Sydney studio. Thanks for coming on To The Point, Senator. I don't know if you heard my opening bit there, where the Abbott government, lowest number of bills passed since Gorton was Prime Minister. Is that something you welcome?
Oh yes. In fact, unless they were repeal bills, which I would vote for, and there should be more of them. But yes, the less legislation, the better. You don't judge a government's effectiveness by the quantity.
What do you make of Joe Hockey's comments yesterday that at the centrepiece of the Coalition's re-election campaign will be income tax cuts? Do you believe it? How significant do you think they'll be?
Yeah, interesting comment. He's actually been saying the same thing in private now for a while, that income tax cuts
What
were
else has he been saying in private?
He's been talking about bracket creep.
Well, he hasn't been talking about that privately. He's been talking about it every second week publicly.
Yeah, okay,
but you've gotten the impression, though, Senator, have you, that from what his private discussions with you and other crossbenchers are, that there is something perhaps, significant on the horizon as far as income tax cuts go?
Yeah, it does seem as if they're going to go to the election with some kind of detailed policy on this. The proof of the pudding is in the expenditure reductions. You know, you can talk the talk about tax cuts and lowering the tax burden on wage and salary earners and all that sort of stuff, but until you talk about reducing expenditure, you're really suggesting that an increase in the deficit is okay, and of course nobody agrees with that.
But they've almost walked away from that, though, Senator, haven't they? I mean, not just because of their own political mortality, which is on the line we see from the polls, but also because they ran into problems, not from the likes of yourself or Senator Day, but there are plenty of other crossbenchers there that are willing to pass spending initiatives but not pass spending restraint legislation.
Yeah, that's quite right. There's a sort of a theoretical notion that maybe budgets should be balanced. You could probably get a majority of people to agree with that, but when you get down to the practicalities of how do you actually balance it, everybody's got a sacred cow, and I think I'm probably the only one who's prepared to vote for any expenditure reduction, with I don't think any exceptions. Everybody's got their favourite one, and when you put all their favourite ones together, nothing's left.
But Senator, this is a $25 billion that's going to need to be cut if we're really going to eradicate bracket creep. Is that realistic to think that the government can do something about bracket creep and fund it solely from cuts alone? Surely they're going to have to look at other areas of expenditure. The Treasurer seems to be suggesting or implying that they're willing to look at things like expanding the GST to cover healthcare. Are you going to get behind that kind of proposal in order to fund cuts to personal income tax?
Well, I suppose it's the overall tax burden. If there was a reduction in income tax and a broadening of the GST base, I might go along with that. I certainly wouldn't if it meant the overall tax burden was raised. But yeah, trade-offs like that. The fact that you can go to the supermarket and there's little asterisks beside some things because they're not subject to GST and some are, I think it's absurd. That sort of thing could easily be ended provided there was an offsetting reduction in income tax. I'd go along with that. But you know, at the end of the day, yes, our tax system is badly broken and needs fixing, and it produces distortions and all that sort of problem. But the bigger problem is that we are spending more than we can afford. That's the issue. And the big items, health, welfare, education, unless we deal with those sort of things, this is just nibbling around the edges.
But the issue, Senator, good market liberals like yourself and I, we well understand that you need to have the right mix of tax in the place that will allow for stimulation and allow the economy to really appropriately grow. The problem is, those Labor types like my colleague here, or the Greens even, they just don't understand what you and I, and indeed Kristina Keneally's parents, good Republicans that they are, they're here visiting, we all understand that the market needs to be given the stimulating measures necessary so that we can really have growth with lower taxes, but you just can't get Labor over the line on this. It's his question.
Right, okay.
It's
Go
a
ahead,
tough,
Senator.
yes, it is a tough argument. I quite agree. One of the ways in which you can address it is to point out that tax cuts nearly always result in increasing tax revenue if you take more than just the immediate short-term response. So what happens is you lower the tax burden on people, they get more economically active, they generate more revenue, they pay more tax, the government collects that tax, makes up for the initial loss of tax revenue that came from cutting the tax rate in the first place. The Reagan tax cuts during President Reagan's term are absolute classic examples of that. So, you know, if I can reassure the people like Labor and the Greens and perhaps Kristina as well, that cutting taxes does not necessarily mean little old ladies missing out on their medicine.
Well, let's talk about that for just a moment, because one of the biggest spending commitments that the federal government has is the NDIS. And the reality is that that is going to have to be funded, and it is going to, I would argue quite credibly, going to grow beyond what is projected to in terms of cost to the government.
You didn't say that when Julia Gillard presented that budget.
Well, I've been making the point quite a lot in time that the growth in disability far exceeds what we currently project are the costs to the budget. So if you look at something like the NDIS, if you look at something like providing care to an aging population, the reality is if we do cut services in order to fund these tax cuts, we do risk that vulnerable people are going to miss out on services that they need to fully participate or to at least live a life of dignity in the Australian community. I mean, when it comes to the NDIS, surely you've got to acknowledge that there are simply things that government has to do that we are currently not doing.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have too much problem with the NDIS as long as it doesn't become a giant gravy train. That's always a risk with these things. But, you know, and I absolutely agree, we cannot allow people to fall through the cracks. There are some needy people. I'm a Libertarian, not an anarchist, and I don't argue with the fact that the government should be there to catch people who fall through the cracks and make sure they don't suffer. But, you know, we have an enormous amount of middle-class welfare. Just one of my favourite topics is the number of people with multi-million-dollar houses drawing pensions. Way too much.
It's ridiculous.
Oh, look, I think we're all on a unity ticket there. Fully believe the family home should absolutely be part of
the problem is the government doesn't. Labor Party's reticent about it. The major parties, David Leyonhjelm. I mean, the problem is
it's not just Labor. Excuse me, it is absolutely.
I started with the government,
but
and then I said Labor.
specifically mentioned Labor.
Oh, I'm so sorry. They're half of the political contest in this country.
Yeah,
I started with the government.
But the Liberal government in this is absolutely unwilling. Even though people like Christopher Pyne argue that the family home should be part of the assessment, his government absolutely unwilling to consider it.
I started with the government. I mean, David Leyonhjelm, you know that the government and Labor are a problem on this because they're trying to capture mainstream voters, many of whom are petrified that this family home might get included in the assets test, even though most people don't benefit from it and those that do, quite frankly, shouldn't.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And that's not the only example of middle-class welfare, of other people's money being paid to people who really don't need it, who could look after themselves much more.
Can I go to one of the areas you've identified as really a gross example, I think, to put words in your mouth, of middle-class welfare, and that's childcare. And of course, childcare is one of the government's key policy pieces. It was supposed to be a childcare-led recovery for the government.
By the way?
Absolutely. Well, you know, Scott Morrison was supposed to bring it in, I believe, before the break. Now he says it's going to be before the summer break.
He's too busy eyeing Tony Abbott's job.
Well, I want to know, what are some of the things that Scott Morrison might be saying to you privately? You alluded earlier what the Treasurer is saying to you privately. What's Scott Morrison saying in his negotiations with the crossbench? Is there any likelihood we're going to see the detail of this childcare package in this term of Parliament?
I think that depends on how the family tax benefit changes go. The proposition he's dealing with, he's not allowed to increase overall expenditure in his portfolio, so increases in expenditure in childcare can only be afforded if he gets his family tax benefit changes through. Now, at the moment, that's not looking all that likely, so I think childcare might be on the back burner until it becomes clear what's happening with FTB. And he's still talking to the crossbench on that. Scott is probably the government's best performer in terms of dealing with the crossbench. he really has got his head around the job. Whether his arguments win the day or not, though, is an interesting thing. The funny thing about it is that he's dealing with conservative crossbenchers, likes of Senators Day and Madigan, for example, who are concerned that FTB is primarily benefiting women who go to work, and the tax system and the benefits system is neglecting stay-at-home mums.
Well, he's got the National Party on board for that as well, you would think. That they have long complained internally of the coalition about that.
Yes, exactly right. Senator Matt Canavan is very strong on that issue and has some very good ideas about how to address it. But of course they would result in a reduction in taxation revenue by, for example, income splitting. Now, the funny thing about it is that Scott Morrison comes from a very similar sort of philosophical background as Senators Canavan, Day and Madigan on that. You know, he's a conservative family person, and he's basically trying to hold them back. So it puts him in an interesting position.
But you've argued that existing subsidies should be more aggressively means tested to ensure they're not directed towards parents who would work regardless of the presence or absence of a subsidy. Yeah. Is that argument getting any positive welcome when you in your conversations with the minister, or are you a lone voice on this one?
My arguments more broadly are that better targeting is warranted, and that goes for a large number of the benefits in the payment system, the transfer system. Amazing number of people are paying tax and then getting the same amount and sometimes more back in benefits, and reducing tax and reducing payments is accepted by Scott Morrison as a desirable outcome. But you know, there's you touched on it before, there's a political issue here. There's the old joke about, I think, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, who asked what should be done about the GFC. He said, we know what should be done, it's just we can't figure out how to do it and stay elected.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's a quite separate issue. I'm just curious to get your reaction to what we basically know is that the government inside the next week will agree to an American request to partake in bombings in Syria and extend the campaign beyond Iraq. What's your
likely
reaction to
with
that?
the Labor opposition support, it seems likely.
Well, who knows? It depends whether Tanya Plibersek, the deputy, wins the day, or whether the leader, Bill Shorten, does. But what is your take on this, Senator?
Well, there are a couple of issues it raises. First of all, I think it should be Parliament's job to approve military commitment in the first place. It's a very serious job to put Australians in harm's way in the interests of their country, and at the moment it's left entirely to the Executive and Prime Minister. But leaving that issue aside, the question I have is when will we know what success is? What will success look like? Do we really realistically believe we can defeat ISIS? And if we do think we can defeat ISIS, what will replace it? My view is that this is a fight that's been brewing for decades. It's sort of been building up for decades, largely between the Sunnis and the Shiite sects in the Islamic religion. And our intervention in it is not going to change anything. When we first committed forces to Iraq, I made public comments saying it will end in frustration. Well, we haven't reached the end yet, but we've certainly reached the frustration stage. So I knew it wouldn't change the course of that conflict. It's not going to change the course of the conflict just because we extend our bombing to Syria either. I can't see why we believe that we can actually change anything there. I don't think we can.
But if you look at the horrifying stories that come out about the systematic use of rape and torture, the absolute disregard for human life, the Prime Minister has compared ISIS, or the death cult as he likes to call them, to the terrors of Pol Pot or Hitler in Germany. I mean, can the world really stand by silently or stand by and not intervene with a stronger military response in the face of such horror and terror?
Yeah, I understand that argument. I think that the concern, that the feeling to do something is genuine. I'm not maligning anybody's motives, but what I am saying is, in practical terms, what we're doing, putting our armed forces in harm's way, spending a lot of money on this, will actually make any difference. humanitarian relief for example, the Yazidis and the Syrian Christians, Iraqi Christians, and so forth. You couldn't argue against that. Saving people's lives by providing them with food and water and shelter and those sort of things, you couldn't argue against that.
Well, Julie Bishop has argued against that in the Parliament, in fact, sledging off Tanya Plibersek for suggesting we provide food aid to Syria.
Yeah, and I wonder why that's the case. You know, they'd rather go in and bomb ISIS and think somehow that's going to help these people that are on the receiving end of the barbaric treatment that ISIS is dishing out, rather than do what we can for the refugees who are trying to flee ISIS. I think the priorities are wrong. Now, if there was a realistic prospect that we could defeat ISIS and that ISIS would be replaced by something that we thought was, you know, substantially better, then maybe my argument wouldn't be as realistic or as cogent. But I cannot see how that's going to happen. Not even the Americans, I think, are capable of defeating ISIS and replacing them with something that we could live with.
Yeah, well, it's always got mission creep when you do try. Senator Leyonhjelm, I know you've got an event that you have to get to at 2 o'clock. We appreciate you joining us on To The Point. Thanks for your company.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
All right, Kristina, what do you think of the latest opinion poll?